Okay, hello and good morning. Massive turnout today. So I've waited until we're over 10% of the people that have signed up for the class. There were like 44 a minute ago, and there's like 400 plus people signed up for the class. Don't make me rethink no, you're of course are the wrong people to address this to, but this might make me rethink the lecture recording policy, honestly. So I hope that a couple more people are coming in. Welcome. I hope you had an interesting time with our second lecture in Comparative Democracies on Monday with my colleague Pontus. You talked about a variety of ways of political engagement, political participation. So logically, today we're going to take the next step and we're going to think about one very particular way to participate in politics, which is, of course, something that we all hopefully do, which is participate in elections. And we're going to think a little bit about elections, and we're going to spend most of our time thinking about the systems that we've come up with, how to translate what we do into some form of representation, something that's also called an electoral system. So obviously the elections are arguably maybe the most fundamental thing that defines a democracy. It's hard to think of a democracy without any kind of elections. The only way that maybe we can think of a type of democracy would be sort of the Athenian, or maybe in some aspects the Swiss system, where literally everyone gets together in the central square or the Aura or something and casts a vote. So something with no representation. But once you outgrow the confines of your relatively small community where that still works, obviously you need some form of representation, which means you need to have elections. So a country that doesn't have elections is very hard to define as democratic. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to compare different electoral systems. Then we're going to put our comparative politics hats on, and we're going to think about how we can use electoral systems as different types of variables and what they can tell us, or maybe what they can explain, or if we want to explain them. And then I'm going to also spend 2 or 3 slides, by the way, that were missing in the version that I uploaded yesterday, so the slides from today are correct. I'm going to spend 2 or 3 slides on referenda, so another way of making your voice heard that doesn't rely on elections. So starting off, I always like to start off with a map. You know me. We see that there is quite a bit of variation in the world of democracies. So almost every country in the world at this point has elections. Note that, of course, this includes countries that we wouldn't necessarily classify as democratic. We need elections to call something democratic, but not everything that has an election is a democratic country. North Korea has elections, although there's only ever one candidate, and if you vote for the wrong person, this might have dire consequences. Not a joke. So there is, of course, elections for the dear leader, but that doesn't mean it's democratic. Nevertheless, almost every country has some form of electoral system, so some way of translating the popular votes into whatever system of representation you have. And you see that there's quite a bit of variation, although we see certain patterns. We see, for example, the yellow world, which includes a lot of countries that were formerly part of the British Empire, that seem to tend towards a plurality system, a majoritarian system, something that we will later on in the course call first past the post. So something that really likes strong majorities. We have another part of the world, the blue world, that is all about proportional representation. So it's not so much who wins, but everyone gets according to their share, which is a very nice and very seemingly maybe fairer way of dealing with voting, but we're going to see the disadvantages of that system later on. And then we have sort of the green world, which you can see, I mean, it's a bit distorted because Russia is in there, just geographically, but you have a significant part of the world where there is sort of a mix between systems. It's neither sort of fish nor meat. It has elements of both majoritarian and proportional systems. So you see there's a good bit of variation, and there's also a couple of countries that are very hard to classify, if they can be classified at all. This includes, of course, some of the countries that currently don't really have that much of a working electoral system or seem to be in transition. The DR Congo is one of those, or South Sudan. is one of them that are currently changing up their system or do not have a kind of a stable electoral system in place. But nevertheless, the world kind of divides more or less into three parts: majoritarian, proportional, and mixed. So if we think about comparing electoral systems, we define our electoral systems very simply as a set of rules, like in a board game, a set of rules that structures how the votes that are cast in an election are then translated into some form of representative measure, say seats in a parliament. So translating votes into offices or seats, that's the base definition of what an election is. That's already it. Now there's of course a huge amount of variation in how elections and electoral systems work. We could, for example, look at just electoral regulations. We could look at rules on the franchise, meaning who is allowed to vote and who isn't. As you will know, sort of general universal, the universal right to vote is a rather recent invention. It took us all the way up until the 19th century, until a couple of countries even got around to thinking to extending the right to vote to all men, let alone maybe not just the men with property, but also all men, or maybe, gasp, even men and women, and maybe even people of all races, and not just white people, for example. So it took us a good while it took the world a good while to come around to extending the franchise to everyone. We could, of course, also think about which candidates are eligible to vote. How old do you have to be? Where do you have to come from? Do you have to be a natural-born citizen, or can you be an immigrant? One of the things that you might or might not know is that even after the right to vote was extended to women, it still took a couple of decades until the countries came around to also allowing women to run. So, of course, it's something to really have the full right to participate in the democracy. It's not enough that you can just cast a vote. You should also be able to stand as a candidate. And again, this wasn't uniformly introduced all around the world. There could be rules on spending. There could be either sort of the state could give you some money as a party or as a candidate, meaning you could sort of raise the floor of how much money you get to campaign, or you could introduce a ceiling. You could put a cap on how much you're allowed to spend on your campaign. Both of those things are, of course, in effect in lots of countries around the world. So the regulation side is one of the points of variation. We could be thinking about electoral formula, and I find this interesting, mostly because I'm not a math person, so it always takes me a while to get my head around how to translate this, how to translate votes into seats, and there's all kinds of cool sounding, mostly having the names of persons, kind of algorithms, how to translate the one thing and the other. We're going to encounter one of these algorithms when I talk about Sweden in a couple of slides. So how do you translate how many votes are cast into how many seats there are? Obviously, if you have 1 million votes cast, you don't have 1 million seats, so you need some kind of rule how to come up with the second based on the first, whether that's a majoritarian or a proportional system. We could be thinking about district magnitude, and of course this is not identical in all countries. You could have countries that where each district, each county, say, or each city has exactly one person representing it. And that is often the case in first-past-the-post systems. Or you could have countries that say, no, like communities can be represented by multiple people. So you can have one city, but you can have that city, for example, elects 3 members of parliament. And all these 3 members of parliament can then say that they represent a part, at least, of the population of that particular district, county, community, whatever the unit of analysis is. And of course, this makes a very fundamental difference in how you even think about representation. If you only elect one person per district, that person is supposed to represent, well, everyone. So not just the people that voted for them, but also everyone else, which is a much different way to think about representation than if you say, well, I was elected with 20% of the vote and I got a seat, so clearly I can speak for these 20% of the people now. And lastly, maybe possibly the thing you've thought least about, we could be thinking about ballot structure. How do ballots look? Do you vote for a candidate and no party? Do you vote for a party and then the party can determine whoever gets the seat? Is there a combination of the two? Can you write in someone's name or can you not? And so on and so forth. So let's look at the first part of variation first, meaning different kind of regulations of who has the right to vote or who can run. So, I mean, obviously, what we've already said is from sort of the mid-19th century, we see this kind of gradual expansion of the vote, first from property, from landowners with property to larger parts of the population, eventually to all men, and eventually from all men to then all citizens of the state itself. But, of course, this was by far not uniformly introduced all around the world. You see a map here with the women's right to vote. I'm not entirely sure if those numbers are actually for the right to vote or the right to stand in elections. But you see there's a good bit of variation here, all the way from New Zealand down here in 1893, which was the first country to introduce women's right to vote. But actually Finland overtook it, and I do remember this from my reading, because Finland was the first country to introduce the right to vote and the right to stand for an election for women. So if you want to look for a country in terms of progressiveness for women, maybe we should look at Finland more than New Zealand. Everyone always knows New Zealand is the first one, but Finland was the first one to allow them to run and stand for election. You could have differences in voting age, obviously. Some of you might, in fact, have voted if you were over 16 at some of the past elections. And there are some countries that, in fact, have a 16-year-old threshold as the voting age for every election. Brazil and Argentina are two examples of this. You could have compulsory voting, which, of course, we in the UK here do not have. But there's a few countries in the world that have compulsory voting that require their citizens to cast their vote. It's not just a choice. You have to turn up. And if you don't turn up, you need a doctor's note or something, or otherwise you'll be fined. Depending on how severe the consequences are of you not turning up, this might, of course, have very different implications in how you see your vote. So, as an example, I think I looked this up for Australia. If you don't turn up, you're on the electoral register in Australia and you don't turn up for an election, there's up to $170 Australian fine. That's quite hefty. It's not something you want to pay just for not turning up for 5 minutes. And you might even have to go to court and be like court ordered to pay fines and everything. So there's quite, it's at least it's very inconvenient to have this happen to you. But of course, most countries in the world do not have compulsory voting. It's voting sort of an act, a non-compulsory act of you. Something that you, if you feel like it, you turn up, and if not, no one seems to care, which is also a weird way maybe of approaching this kind of citizen's responsibility. You could have differences in who the funding parties are. I already said this, right? The state could, for example, assign every party sort of a base level of funding with which they can campaign. This is the case in Germany, for example, where the state provides, once you've over a certain threshold in an election, meaning as a proportion of the seats, then the state will provide some funding for you. So you don't have to do all your fundraising yourself. The UK doesn't have that. There's no state support for parties, but there is a cap on how much parties can sort of earn or take in. So very different approaches. Obviously, the German idea, or the idea that the state can support parties, has this idea of leveling the playing field a little bit. You shouldn't be able to just run a great campaign because you're so damn good at extracting money out of everyone, or rich people, or whoever gives you money, or corporations. There might even actually be bans on, very strict limits on how much others can give you once the state has provided you with some funding. Again, the idea of sort of fairness between all the parties running. You could have differences in incumbency rules, obviously. Is there different rules when you're an incumbent versus when you're a challenger? We could lower variation in whether or not parliaments have fixed terms. There is parliaments that don't have fixed terms and that basically themselves decide whenever the next election should roll around, or maybe some other actor in the political system decides when the next elections will be held. Some countries have what's called coterminous elections, meaning you turn up for a federal election and it just so happens that your local election happens at the same time, which of course can have advantages. If people tend to turn out more for federal elections, then maybe you get them to turn out more, obviously, for the local elections too. If you held them on different dates, it might well be that turnout is very low for local elections versus maybe somewhat higher for federal elections. But there might, of course, be a trade-off here, right? If you have people turn up for two different elections on the same day, they might well not really apply maybe all those different heuristics to the one election from the other, meaning they might just vote for the same party, obviously without really caring, or if the one party screwed up on the federal level, they might well be punished on the local level, even if they did nothing wrong. And then lastly, we can think in terms of regulations about variation for thresholds to enter Parliament. You know this from some parliaments around the world, I'm sure, is that getting one vote is normally not enough to get a seat in Parliament. Maybe not even getting 100,000 votes might be enough for Parliament. Most parliaments set a certain threshold, and this is especially relevant, of course, for proportional systems, where a party can sometimes get 0.5%, 2%, 2.5%, and then the question becomes, how small can you let a party be to still get assigned a seat in Parliament? And most countries normally settle sort of between the 3 to 5% range. 4%, there's lots of 5% ranges around the world. So now we come to sort of systematic variations. So this is just variation in terms of regulations for the electoral system. And now we think a little bit about sort of systemic variation. So one of those interesting pieces of variation between electoral systems is the district magnitude. You can have single-member districts, like I already said, right, where exactly one person represents one district. This is the case in many of those first-past-the-post systems, first-past-the-post systems that are part of the former British Empire, such as the UK or Canada, or in the US also, for most districts. You can have multi-member wards, meaning every individual district can elect several people that represent it in Parliament, and normally the number of people coming from that district has to do with the size, population size, maybe geographical size of that district. Or you could just not have any districts and have everyone run against everyone. This is normally the case in smaller countries because in Slovakia or New Zealand, with relatively small populations and relatively small geography, it might not make sense to split that up in 50 more communities because the units get too small. Obviously, one of the interesting things that comes out of this is something we call gerrymandering. So when you have, this is especially the case in the US, of course, where the word comes from, where you have single-member districts, so every district can only ever be represented by one person, which, especially if the party in power can redraw those district lines, which oftentimes they can't in other countries, but in the US they can every few years, this, of course, incentivizes parties to make districts, even if they look super weird and have nothing to do with real-world geography, just to ensure that that one district elects their person. And you end up with, for example, this is one of the famous cases here. This is a district in North Carolina that looks so thoroughly weird that someone thought that it looks like one of those leafy sea dragons, you know, BBC Planet Earth kind of floaty things in the ocean, which I think is quite fitting. But again, I mean, if you look at that, that makes absolutely no sense, obviously, right? This is not based on sort of historical borders. This is certainly not based on the borders of a city or of a distinct community. This is cut in a particular way so that one party has an advantage, because there can only ever be one party elected from that district. If this was a proportional system, this wouldn't make sense because you can elect several people from the same district, so you don't have to do all this kind of cutting and pasting to ensure that your one person wins, because you can have several winners of seats in that district. So that's district magnitude. So one interesting part of variation. We can also think about ballot structure. So lots of countries have closed lists, meaning you are presented with a list by the party that made the list, and you can't make any changes. If you want to vote for the party, you have to accept whoever they put on that list and in whatever order. So this obviously takes a bit of choice away from you as a voter if you thought you might want that particular choice. You could have open lists, meaning the exact opposite of that. You can vote for example, you can cast your vote for a party, but you can indicate which of the candidates on that party list you like in particular. Or you can rank order them. Some countries give you a few votes, and then you can give sort of your first, your most preferred, your second most preferred, your third most preferred candidate, your vote. It might even be a possibility for you to, for example, vote for a party and write in your own candidate. That's not the case in many countries because it gets very messy at some point. But Sweden, for example, is one of those countries that allows you to write in your own person that you want to give your vote to, whether or not they belong to a party. And then lastly, you can also have a ballot that allows you preferential voting across candidates. So not just ranking the candidates of whatever party you support, but just saying, well, I like this guy from Labour and this lady from the Tories and this man from the SNP or something. And this is, for example, the case in some in Ireland is the most prominent example, and then we have some other cases like Northern Ireland, Malta, and some of I think the Australian Senate is elected like this too. So you basically you just have a buffet in front of you, and you can kind of order whatever you want, regardless of what party that particular candidate comes from. So kind of an increase of choice in how much control you have over which candidate you give your vote to, from closed lists to open lists to kind of preferential voting across parties. And then lastly, the electoral formula plays a large role in how we classify these systems, right? Is this a simple plurality? So whoever gains the most votes wins, meaning if you have 10 candidates and one of them gets 11% and everyone else gets like 9% or so, then the 11% person gets it. Is your electoral system built on an absolute majority? So can only the person win the seat that has actually received over 50% of the votes, which is quite a high threshold sometimes, especially if you have a lot of people running. So these absolute or qualified majorities are often only in place in systems that have multiple rounds of voting, where kind of, candidates successively drop out until you emerge with a candidate that garners the most support. And then, of course, you could have electoral formulas that just do away with all these kind of plurality, majority, all this stuff. They just ignore that, and they work on pure proportionality, meaning if you get 10% of the vote, you should get 10% of the seats. And we'll see later that Sweden, for example, is one of those countries that does that. And there's good arguments for and against that. So the world kind of divides, as I just said in the map already, into these three sort of larger systems. We have plurality or majoritarian systems. We have proportional systems and mixed systems. The plurality systems have sort of simple plurality, first past the post. However, is the first person that makes it past a particular, a majority of all the votes, gets elected or gets the seat. You could have an alternative vote system or a two-ballot system. So kind of we introduce a couple of tweaks to the plurality system, but what they all have in common is they're very focused on the candidate normally, and they are sort of winner-takes-all systems. If you lose, and you get absolutely nothing for it, whether you're a party or an individual candidate. You have proportional systems, again, that work normally these work as list systems, where you have a list of candidates and a number of parties. And but again, there's some tweaks on this. For example, there's some places that have the single transferable vote. Again, Ireland is one of these. And then if any one of you has participated in Scottish local elections, you might have encountered this too, where you can say, well, I'm going to vote for this person, but if that person doesn't get elected, then this person's my second preference. If that person also doesn't get elected, this person's my third preference. And so whenever your candidate kind of drops out because they got the least amount of votes, your ballot isn't worthless. We are then looking at who did you give your second vote to, and that again is tallied up. That's normally also happens in a number of rounds. So even proportional systems might have different ways to translate your votes into those proportions. And then we have mixed systems, which are actually quite common. We're going to see that in a second, and are getting more common. So you can have systems that combine elements of majoritarian systems and of proportional systems, normally because they see some weaknesses in either of these. So, and again, these can work in different types of ways. We have the one system where you have a vote for a candidate and a vote for a party. And we have systems where you again can cast several votes, but these are used to balance each other out. Really quickly, which of you did the research briefing on the electoral system? Just quick show of hands. Okay, quite a few of you, so you know all of this. Feel free to add information or correct me, by the way, because you've probably done more research at this point in the last week at least. So what we see here is a sort of quick look around the world. We already saw geographically that there's a good bit of variation, and we see that just based purely on the number of countries that have adopted a particular system, we see that proportional representation seems to be kind of the runaway winner, normally with a list type system, with 70 countries having adopted the system, just ahead of first past the post. But what we do see is once we take into consideration how many people are actually using this system, so not just how many countries, but how many people, we see that first past the post still is the most popular system in terms of number of citizens that are using this. And this is, of course, because you have a couple of very large countries in the world that are using this compared to list PR. And the mixed member systems are still somewhat lower here, like the systems that combine both of the some characteristics of the other two. But we've seen an increase of this over the last couple of years. So let's think about Majoritarian systems for a little bit and think about their advantages and disadvantages. There's probably nothing new for those of you that wrote the research briefing on it, but for all those other ones, this might be new information. So of course we have the advantage that this is a fairly simple system. It's a simple to understand system. If you compare all of you and you get the most votes, you get it. Like if there's 20 of you and whoever gets the most votes, you get the seat. That's a nice, easy to understand system. And it normally produces, because it produces clear winners, it also produces kind of strong governments without the need for coalitions necessarily, because you have clear outcomes in every individual district, which should then add up in sum to a clear outcome on the federal level. And it kind of encourages parties to be sort of broadly based. So you want to obviously take as many people under your umbrella as possible to be able to ensure that you get the most votes. And it is a system that is balanced away from extremist parties, which is quite a neat feature. So if you are worried, for example, in your country that there is extremism on the rise, and maybe some of you considered this in designing your own electoral system, if you're worried about extremists, it might be a good idea to introduce a first past the post system, mostly because it's very hard for extremist fringe parties to actually get a majority in any individual ward. Or even if they get a majority in the district, normally this is going to be locally confined. So obviously they will get seats, but probably not particularly many, because they're geographically limited. And of course, there's a clear link between you in a geography and your representative. When you live there, if you live there, you have one person representing you, and that's the end of that. Now, of course, there's a number of big disadvantages, and this is well known, of course, and some of the other systems were designed to get around these disadvantages. So you have, of course, an exaggeration of the electoral results. You can have a party that in every individual district wins like 11% of the vote, but because there was 30 parties running, that's the highest margin of victory that they ever got. So 11% in every single district. And they get all the seats in parliament, even though, of course, in every individual district, 89% of the people didn't cast their vote for them, which, of course, is deeply unfair. Why should they be in charge if really a vast majority of voters did not cast their vote for them? But that's how first past the post systems work. So the party with the most seats isn't necessarily the party with most votes, and we see this in quite a number of systems and countries that have adopted this. One of the classic cases in recent years is, of course, the US presidential election. Works like this, too, where you had Donald Trump win by votes in the Electoral College, but lose the popular vote, as we all know. So there was a majority of people that actually didn't cast their vote for him. You have a large number of wasted votes, because absolutely everyone that didn't vote for the candidate or the party that got the district, their vote is just worthless. It doesn't matter. It didn't matter for who you cast your vote or which party. This is just something that's not considered, because if you don't vote for the winner, you lose. It does generally lower turnout, because, for example, if you think that your concerns are minority concerns, then you don't really have an incentive to turn up, because you're not going to win anyway, so why even go there and vote? So if you have for example, if you have a strong affinity to green parties, but you already know that the Green Party at best gets, what, like 10% of the vote or so in your district. There's no point in even turning up because they're not going to win in a first-past-the-post system. There's an interesting effect here where there's a possibility of regional fiefdoms. So you can have particular parts of the country where one party is especially strong, and then they get the seat there, but no one else. And of course, we can see this with some of the parties in the UK Parliament at the moment. So parties that are strong enough in particular localities to win first past the post, but not basically get any votes anywhere else. The idea that you suddenly have a parliament that is weirdly very regionally split and that has some parties in it that are very, very locally based and don't necessarily feel like they're representing all of the population or all of the geography of your country might have some problems built in. And of course, you have a very highly increased, as I explained in gerrymandering, you have an increased importance of electoral boundaries. It's very important where your electoral district ends because only ever one person can win it. So if the lines are drawn wrong, you might not ever get elected because there's a part of a city in there that generally doesn't vote for you. So let's make a quick little excursion, and I'm just going to go over this fairly quickly. Do we have anyone here? Do we have a friend from Singapore here by any chance? No? Is anyone? Okay. Yes, okay, perfect. So you correct me if any of this is wrong, okay? Did you actually vote in some last elections? So you were absent then. Did you have to send in a note or something to excuse yourself? Okay, interesting. So you might have gotten around the whole compulsory voting thing there. Maybe you discovered a loophole. So technically voting is compulsory in Singapore, and I think there's a fine of up to 50 Singapore dollars, which is probably not prohibitive. I mean, you can just take that if it's every 4 years, I guess. But you are supposed to turn up and cast your vote. Until 1988, this was generally a first-past-the-post system, classic sort of Westminster style, and single-member constituencies. But today, we actually see that the Parliament has 3 distinct kind of classes of members of Parliament. You have sort of regular MPs that have been elected in some first-past-the-post system, and they have 89 of the seats of Parliament. But you have 2 other things that are kind of unique to the Singaporean system. You have what's called non-constituency MPs. So some of the best performing candidates that didn't quite make it in first-past-the-post, so some of the best losers, in a sense, are offered seats in Parliament. They're offered, there's a total of 9 seats. So you see, this is less than 10% of the Parliament in total, but still the idea to kind of soften the blow of a first-past-the-post system a little by giving out some seats to those that lost. Some people have called this a PR exercise, mostly because those MPs actually don't have all the rights of the other MPs. They can, for example, not vote on budgetary matters. And then you have a third category, which I always found interesting, which is nominated MPs. So the president can just go, yep, this person represents, for example, the arts, or this is an acclaimed film director, or this is someone, I don't know, representing communities with a particular disease or something. Whoever you think could be socially representative of a group that doesn't necessarily have other representation avenues open to them, they get nominated to Parliament, and you just become an MP. You never necessarily ran for an election, you aren't affiliated with a party, but you can still sit in Parliament. And these tend to be sort of societally known figures, I don't know, kind of maybe doctors, artists, some other people of public life. So you have already the idea that, well, this first-past-the-post thing needs to be softened a little bit. And then you have another thing that I find a really interesting twist on first-past-the-post, which is that in 1988, the group representation constituencies were introduced. You probably can't read this on the map, but you can see that there's different colors on this map of Singapore. And so they went away from only having single-member districts to districts that have more than one member, which, again, normally is something that we associate with proportional systems. But what this essentially is in every ward that has more than one member, so that's every ward that's not colored pink, so actually a majority geographically of Singapore, you actually don't cast your vote for a candidate, you cast your vote for a party block. So a party assembles a team of candidates, and then you vote for that team of candidates, and whichever party block gains the most votes gets all their people onto seats, right? And these party blocks have to include some minority representation. So you can't just have 5 Singaporeans run. You need to have someone in your team that represents some local minorities. But of course, there's a couple of unresolved problems in the system. But you can already see that even those that used to have a very regular standard first past the post system have already tried to tinker with that system a little bit and add other elements that might qualify the disadvantages of a first past the post system. Was anything that I said completely wrong? Okay, good, thank you. All right, so moving on to proportional systems, okay, the other kind of very big category of countries in the world. And so obviously we have there's a certain aspect of fairness to the system. If you get 10% of the votes, you'll probably also deserve 10% of the seats. Why should that not be the case? Why does it have to be winner takes all? The advantage is, of course, that the whole electorate is sort of involved in electing the parliament, the representation, and also in determining the government eventually, because no one really wastes their vote. Even if you vote for a very small party, as long as they get over the threshold, you will have some representation in parliament, and you're not reliant on some other big party that, out of sheer generosity, takes your concerns on board. It makes it easier for atypical candidates to be selected and elected, mostly because you don't only have to run the one person that has the highest chance of getting elected, but you can have several people that get elected from wards. And obviously it encourages parties to have sort of a wide-ranging appeal, meaning the appealing in many different localities, appealing to many different groups of people. And you have, of course, a somewhat greater continuity and stability because you don't have these hard kind of binary kind of tidal shifts, earthquake-like things like as you see, for example, whenever you have an election in the UK, where the sides switch from Tory to Labour, or in the US when the president changes from a Democrat to a Republican. But you have sort of more gradual shifts because there's a wider variety of interests represented. You have, of course, the risk of party fragmentation. This is often the case in systems that are proportional, that you, have a lot of parties because you can already get in if you only appeal to 5% of the voters, or even 4% or even 3%. And the lower the threshold is, the higher is your risk that you will have party fragmentation. So suddenly you have 16 parties in the parliament that all have to agree on something or agree on forming a government, which oftentimes is a nightmare. So coalition governments are hard, which is why it's something that we might not want to encourage. And of course, the link between voters and representatives is slightly less clear in a proportional system. It's certainly not as clear as in a first past the post system. And it's a more difficult to understand system. The whole kind of rules about how to translate votes into proportions and seats, and the fact that you are in one city, but there's multiple people supposedly representing you, and if you have a concern, who's responsible for you? Is it the person that you voted for, or someone else? Who knows? So it's a system that's slightly more difficult to understand. Do we have anyone from Sweden here? Okay, perfect. So again, same deal, right? So if I say anything that's untrue, you correct me, please. Sweden is one of the truest proportional systems in the world. I'm going to explain in a second what I mean by that. There is 310 fixed constituency seats, and then 39 additional seats that are used to balance out if, for some reason, the pure proportional system doesn't generate quite the same proportionality in seats when it comes to that. You have party lists, but in an interesting twist, you might have encountered this if you voted the last time. You have party lists, and each party basically puts a ballot out in front of the voting booth that you then have to walk up to, and then you have to pick the party ballot of the party you want to support. It's a bit weird because it's not entirely secret, right, what you choose. Like if you walk up there confidently and you're like, yes, moderates, and you walk into your voting booth, everyone essentially knows what you voted. So I think one of the tricks is that everyone always takes a ballot of each, and then you only fill it out once you're in the voting booth. Is that roughly correct? Yes. Oh, okay. All right. More power to you. If you're not brave enough to stand for what you vote for. So, so you can vote for a party list. You can indicate preferences on party lists, and most crucially, you can just fill out your own sort of ballot. You can cast a vote for a party and then write in a person that you think should receive that seat. And there have been instances in the past where write-in candidates have actually received seats, mostly on the local level. And then the votes are converted into seats with something that we call the Webster-Saint-Léger method, which is this equation here. So imagine you have three parties with 30,000, 20,000, and 10,000 votes. The 30,000 votes party clearly gets the first seat because they have the most votes. After they've been assigned the first seat, their votes are divided by 2 times seats plus 1, meaning they've had the first seat assigned, and then their 30,000 votes is divided by 3. So meaning for the second seat, we pretend like they only received 10,000 votes, which means the second seat goes to the second party, the one with 20,000 votes. And then that calculation is repeated until all seats have been filled, which is a pretty old method from the 19th century, but it's still employed for assigning seats. There's a 4% threshold for representation that you can see actually from the last results that there's quite a number. This is 8 parties represented in Parliament, which is of course a lot more than in some other democracies. But the most important aspect here is if you look at how the vote share of the party and how the percentage of the seats in Parliament that they get, this is almost identical. This is about as good as you can get. So if you have 7.9% of the vote, you also get 8% of the seats. So it's a very, very proportional system, if you can put that on a scale. So it's a system that puts great stock into how proportional the results are. But of course, you have problems. Voting secrecy might not be a problem really, but the bigger problem that you have is party fragmentation. After the last election, it was extremely hard for Sweden to form a government. It took several rounds. Several people were asked to form a government until eventually in, I don't know, the 4th or 5th or so round of negotiations, you finally came up with a leader because, of course, whoever leads a coalition government here needs several parties to work together and support them if they want to form a stable government. Okay, and then we have some other systems, some more exotic systems. Most of those systems are designed to fix problems with the other 2 big systems, proportional versus majoritarian. The biggest category here are these mixed-member proportional systems, like in Germany, for example, where you cast a vote for a party and a vote for a candidate, and these 2 things are then used to balance each other out. You have a system that I think I've already talked about one of my very first lectures, which I find quite interesting. You can have systems that work on the so-called border count. There's only one system, one country in the world that employs this for their parliamentary elections, which is Nauru. You see the Nauru Parliament here, that's the island, that's the whole thing. And then at the bottom you see the Parliament of Nauru with its 19 seats. So the border count system is used to elect candidates here, and the border count is unique because it's a positional voting system. So it allows you to state your preferences about several candidates running, and what the system is designed to do is it's designed to then give the win to the candidate that's least offensive to the most people, rather than necessarily the one that has the most first preferences from the most people. So just as an illustration, you can have a ranked, this is simplified obviously, you can have a ranked system. You give 3 votes to the person you like most, 2 votes for your second preference, and 1 vote for your least favorite person. So if you have 5 voters doing this, you see that 3 voters have expressed their strongest preference for category A. So if you assume that in the first past the post system, they would give their 1 vote to this person, you would think that in the first past the post system, candidate A is elected. But what's interesting about candidate A is they're liked by 3 people, but they're really, really disliked by 2 people. So in a border count system, what you actually do is you elect a different candidate, namely candidate 2, because even though candidate 2 only got 2 first preferences, they got more second preferences from more people, and therefore they are elected. So I'm not going to go into the formula that's behind this, but the idea is that you can have a different way of tallying votes, of course, that ends up with different types of candidates being systematically elected, which is really interesting given that all this is essentially an algorithm, but it can really influence in who sits in parliament and who doesn't. So when we think about comparative politics, now we put our comparative politics hats on and we think a little bit about what we can, how we can think about electoral systems. We can think about them in maybe 3 different ways. We can first consider electoral systems as a dependent variable. So what actually led to a country adopting that particular electoral system? So elections as an outcome. Is this related to size, for example? Is something like border count fine in Nauru, but you can't do it anywhere else? Or do you need a certain level of democratic literacy to have people use proportional systems rather than first past the post? Right? How do you deal, for example, with the fact that you have a newly democratizing country and you might not have people that are either literally literate or just politically literate enough to understand, for example, they can vote for several people rather than just give one vote? That's the easier way. So there's a number of studies kind of that thinks about this. One of the more important things is that rarely are electoral systems ever beautifully designed by people in an air-conditioned room that have all these rational choice concerns for the citizens. Normally, of course, electoral systems themselves are the result of a political process. And there's this Pippa Norris quote that says that they're normally dragged kicking and screaming into the world out of a political negotiation process rather than a beautifully designed. We can also think, of course, about electoral systems as an independent variable. What does an electoral system do? What effects does it have? And that is maybe for the most part, what I talked about today already. So you can, for example, see, of course, that majoritarian systems lend themselves to a two-party system based on something we call Duverger's law. Which says that if you have a first-past-the-post system, you will inevitably, at some point, end up with a two-party system. There might be some very, very small fringe groups that can also get into parliament. For the most part, first-past-the-post will result in a two-party system. While proportional representation, of course, ends up with multi-party representation because there can be multiple winners, so to say, of seats. You could be thinking, for example, about whether a proportional representation system, where supposedly a larger part of society is represented in parliament, does that, for example, have an easier time generating societal consensus? Do you have an easier time coming up with answers to the pressing problems of our time if you have a proportional system, rather than one where the winner just takes all and whoever else doesn't get elected just has to eat their vote? And of course, you can think about such things as what effect does an electoral system have on the representation of particular groups? This could be minorities, this could be women, this could be the representation of particular societal concerns, like environmental concerns, human rights concerns, and so on. So in this case, we treat the electoral system as an independent variable, as a cause of something else. So, in the cause of thinking about what elections can really do, normally what we have to do is distinguish between different types of elections. I'm only going to go through this for a second, because obviously these different elections might each have different causes of how they work out, and they might have different effects in what they do. For example, you can have very different dynamics at work for an election on the European level compared to an election on the federal level. Or maybe sometimes you don't, and you have the exact same dynamics working for an election, for example, on the European level, as you have on the federal level, and then one could argue that that might not be a good idea. Meaning, if people take into consideration their worries about their own country's federal level, and they use those worries to then cast votes for a completely different election for a different level of representation, that can create all kinds of problems, of course. And then lastly, of course, we can think about elections sort of as contextual variables, like things that sort of go in between other variables that are actually of interest to us. We could think about sort of what effect does this have on citizenship, on images of citizenship or citizenship rights, whether voting is compulsory or not. Or is your citizenship a responsibility, or is it just a right? And you have also the right to kind of refuse to participate in the democracy that has given you that right. We could think about the effects of elections on voters, so-called election fatigue. You're constantly being asked to do something. This is a bit like us constantly asking you for feedback. There's a certain point where, yes, feedback is nice, but there's also something we call feedback fatigue. So if you have to fill out a damn postcard every other week, you're going to get tired of this, and you're not going to give as much feedback as we might want to. The same, of course, is true for elections. And, of course, we could think about sort of contextual effects on elections. So kind of what effects do positive or negative campaigning have on turnout or on voter choice? What effects does media reporting have on election, and so on? So there's a multitude of different ways how we can approach elections, either as a dependent or an independent variable, or maybe an intervening variable in the middle. Now, my last two slides for the last 2 minutes, I just want to talk about another way, of course, to participate in democracy rather than just elections, which is referendums. And referendums have seen quite an upswing in recent years in how much they've been employed. So, of course, one of the ways could be to participate in the democracy couldn't be to ask you to elect a representative who then makes choices. It could just be to ask you directly on an issue how you feel about it, or in which direction the country should go. There's, of course, a number of different ways to go about this. There might be constitutionally mandated referendums. You might be able to initiate a referendum just on a whim, more or less. And they could be either decision promoting, so meaning they just give legitimacy to something that has already been decided. It's probably the less exciting type of referendum. Or they could be decision controlling. They could be determining this is the direction that the government or the country has to go in. And of course, you can have consultative referendums versus referendums that are actually binding. You have sometimes these infuriating situations where a referendum is consultative and cannot be binding, but somehow everyone in the system treats it like it's binding. It's kind of weird. And of course, there could be all number of political reasons why actors treat non-binding referenda as binding. That's, of course, exactly the situation we're in currently. So there's a number of advantages to this, of course. It empowers the electorate. You're not asked to cast your vote every 4 years, and then you just go home and you don't care about this kind of stuff anymore. And the system doesn't care about your opinion either for 4 years, but you're being asked directly. It might encourage you to inform yourself over certain issues. It normally delivers a clear verdict. If you have a majority for something, then that's it, and that's the decision that the country has to take. And it adds legitimacy to this, too, because it's not just some elected representative somewhere that decided this. It was you, the people, that did this. But, of course, there's just as much, there's probably just as much cons to this. Obviously, the electorate isn't always informed. It doesn't always vote on the right issues. It might not actually deliver a clear verdict, but you get all these 49-51 results, especially for very contentious issues. And it might invite politics to unduly reduce the complexity of issues. Some things cannot be decided with a yes and no vote, but you also can't ask voters to write a little essay before they cast their vote, so what are you going to do? Maybe there's some things that you shouldn't ask the general populace about. But regardless of how you see the pros and cons, we can see that over the last couple of years, they've seen a meteoric rise. We can see on the left the number of countries that have held referendums in a particular year, right? So this is not cumulative, this is in every given year, and you see there's quite a few. And mostly these referenda are initiated by the legislator or the government, the legislature or the government itself. So it's not citizens that say, hey, we want a say in this. It is, on the opposite hand, the political system itself that seems to want reassurance in what it's doing. So, in summary, we have hugely varying electoral systems all around the world, all of which are super, super interesting, and I invite you to study them. We have oftentimes the best way to do this is in a large N way, because we have lots of data available on electoral systems, and elections is one of the best studied phenomenons in political science. But you do need a clear question, otherwise it's very hard to understand, are elections a dependent variable for you, are they an independent variable, or something else? Okay, thanks very much for your attention. Have a good week.